No one remembered the exact moment Westeros went bankrupt. It didn't happen in a single day, not with a loud crash or a sword drawn in anger, but with quiet signatures on parchment, sealed letters sent across the narrow sea, and interest rates that rose like a slow tide swallowing kings. By the time King Tommen Baratheon was dead, and Cersei Lannister had crowned herself queen, the Iron Bank had already extended more than coin. They had funded wars, rebuilt fleets, and bought loyalty in places Cersei never even heard of. And now, with the Seven Kingdoms half burning in rebellion, and winter still crawling across the land, the bill had come due. And Westeros couldn't pay. At first, the Iron Bank acted as it always did, cold, polite, and dangerously calm. Ravens were sent. Diplomats arrived, always dressed in dark Braavosi robes, their faces unreadable. They reminded Queen Cersei of the debt. Quietly, respectfully, she laughed them out of the Red Keep. So the bank responded, not with words, but with coin. And with coin came chaos. Within a moon's turn, ships bearing the black seal of Braavos began to arrive at ports up and down Westeros' coast. They didn't carry merchants. They carried mercenaries. The Golden Company had long been a tool of distant wars, but now they marched under a new banner, one forged in Braavosi steel, and stamped with the sigil of the Iron Bank, a clenched fist holding a single gold coin. Behind them came other sellswords, men of ruthless efficiency who didn't ask questions, only how much they'd be paid. In the north, whispers reached Sansa Stark that the Iron Bank had funded a fresh army in White Harbor. The Manderleys, always half loyal, had accepted Braavosi gold in return for protection contracts. Protection from what? From debts owed by the crown, from chaos, from dragons. Even worse, the Brotherhood without banners, once rebels for the people, had been quietly crushed. Their leaders were found poisoned, their camps burned. No one claimed it, but those in the know whispered the faceless men had been hired. And who else could afford them but the Iron Bank? Then the letters stopped being polite. In King's Landing, a final raven arrived from Braavos, sealed in obsidian black wax. Cersei opened it with her usual sneer, but when she read the parchment, her face paled. Default declared. Liquidation of assets to begin immediately. Her first thought was, what assets? What could the Iron Bank even take? She found out the next morning when gold vanished from the royal vaults. Not stolen, but claimed. Her own guards had turned. The commander of the City Watch had been bought, not bribed. Bought, the bank didn't seduce with promises. It purchased loyalty outright. The streets of King's Landing began to shift. Merchants suddenly refused coin stamped with the lion of House Lannister. They asked for Braavosi marks instead. The city's goldsmiths, fearing reprisals, began melting Lannister gold and reshaping it into neutral coins. Even the sept, rebuilt with borrowed funds, was now considered property of the bank. The High Septon was forced to publicly acknowledge that the Iron Bank had moral ownership of all, sanctified structures funded by debt. Meanwhile, beyond the capital, things unraveled fast. The Riverlands descended into anarchy. Lord Edmure Tully returned to his ancestral seat, found his bannermen abandoning him. Why? Because they'd taken Braavosi loans to rebuild. And the Iron Bank offered forgiveness if they pledged loyalty not to House Tully, not to the Queen, but to the bank. A quiet civil war began to smolder. It wasn't fought over thrones or dragons or prophecies. It was fought over contracts. Lords turned against lords not for glory, but because a faceless man in a Braavosi robe told them, "You owe us or you're nothing." And nothing meant death. By the end of the second moon, 3 major houses had declared independence from the crown, not in rebellion, but as a restructuring under the guidance of the Iron Bank. Westeros wasn't being conquered. It was being foreclosed. War never began with a roar, not when gold led the charge. In Westeros, this new kind of war, the one waged in silence and ink, in betrayal and debt, had already reached every corner of the realm. Cersei thought herself safe behind the Red Keep's walls. But even walls crumble when the masons are paid to look the other way. The Iron Bank didn't send an army to the gates of King's Landing, not yet. Instead, they bled her slowly. Her ships stopped receiving supplies from the Reach. Her ravens went unanswered, and her court shrank by the day. Lords and ladies excused themselves from the capital and never returned. Some had been bought. Others simply saw the writing on the wall. She clutched her wine-glass harder than ever now, barely sleeping, pacing the marble halls like a ghost haunting her own home. Jaime had left her months before. Tyrion was with the Dragon Queen, and her last real ally, Qyburn, only offered whispers of hidden enemies and debts that couldn't be killed with wildfire. "My queen," Qyburn said one night, "Braavos has no throne to claim, but it has already taken yours in pieces, and the small folk are beginning to starve." Cersei slammed her goblet against the stone. "Then let them starve. Let them rot. I will not kneel to a bank." But kneeling wasn't necessary. The Iron Bank didn't want her crown. It wanted her crown's value, her soldiers, her land, her keep, her soul. And they would take it all, piece by piece. South of King's Landing, the Stormlands had become the bank's first official puppet state. Gendry, once a bastard smith, now called himself Lord of Storm's End, backed by Braavosi, ships and foreign advisors. He owed his rise to a deal struck in secret with a Braavosi broker named Miro Voller, a man with no title but the power to crush kingdoms. Gendry's allegiance wasn't personal. He hadn't forgotten the crown's crimes. He simply knew the world had changed, and gold, not blood, ruled now. "I'll build my house with iron," he said once to a bannerman, "and let the dragons and lions burn each other down." To the north, Sansa Stark watched this new chaos unfold with wary eyes. She sat in Winterfell's hall beside Maester Roderick, reading reports of Braavosi investment agents entering towns under the guise of rebuilding roads and feeding the poor. "They offer protection from the debt," Roderick said, shaking his head, "but then they claim the land. They say it was used as collateral by King Robert, King Joffrey, and Queen Cersei. They claim Winterfell itself is under lien." Sansa's lips thinned. "Winterfell is no one's to claim." "But if they send sellswords?" he asked. "If they send faceless men?" She didn't respond. She didn't have to. The truth sat between them like a shadow. The North had never truly broken free. It had only been leased back to her until the Iron Bank decided otherwise. Meanwhile, Daenerys Targaryen, who had once been their debtor too, watched the war unfold from Dragonstone. Unlike Cersei, she had paid her debts. Tyrion had insisted on it. "If we don't pay, they'll own you," he had warned. "If we do, at least we get to choose our ruin." She had listened. She had repaid the Iron Bank in full, through gold looted from Casterly Rock and gifts from Meereen's vaults. But it hadn't bought her loyalty, only distance. Now the Iron Bank wanted Cersei's head and Dany's silence. They offered her neutrality for a price. "They want me to stay out of it," she muttered, staring into the sea. "To let them bleed Westeros dry while I watch from the cliffs like a coward." "You paid your debt," Tyrion reminded her. "Let the lioness fall alone." But Dany's hands trembled. "If they take the throne from her with gold, what stops them from doing the same to me?" She was no longer fighting just for justice. Now she was fighting for ownership of the dream she'd crossed the world for. And somewhere deep in Nzia, Dark alleys of Bravos, in the quiet halls of the Iron Bank, men with cold eyes studied maps of Westeros, not as a kingdom, but as an investment portfolio. A failing one, a fractured one, a ripe one. In the heart of Bravos, far from the war-torn fields and crumbling castles of Westeros, Miro Voller adjusted the sleeves of his black velvet coat and stared into a glowing brazier of blue fire. He wasn't a lord, a warrior, or a king. He didn't ride horses or command armies. He simply calculated numbers, debts, patterns. And now he calculated the value of a dying continent. A young clerk approached, nervous. The Black Months of Dorne have agreed to full restructuring. Their lands are now under Bravosi investment, my lord. Ah, sir. Miro didn't look up. They will regret it, but not yet. He waved the boy away and turned back to the fire. A new parchment lay on his table, sealed in blood-red wax. Winterfell, the North still refused them. Sansa Stark had denied the bank's agents entry. A bold move, and costly. We will give her time, Miro said quietly to the room, though he was alone. She'll come begging when the snows last longer than her food stores. That was the thing about power. It didn't need to shout. It simply waited for the world to become desperate. Back in Westeros, desperation was spreading like rot. The Riverlands had fractured beyond repair. House Bracken pledged itself to the Iron Bank in exchange for exclusive grain trade rights. House Blackwood refused and watched 3 of its villages burned in a single night by masked mercenaries speaking Valyrian. Lord Edmure Tully wrote to Cersei for aid. He received no reply. Cersei, meanwhile, was no longer queen in anything but name. Her court had shrunk to less than 30 people, a skeleton council of frightened nobles and paid thugs. The Iron Bank had poisoned her not with blades, but with isolation. The gold cloaks had switched allegiances entirely. New guards in black and silver. Bravosi armor patrolled the city's ports, overseeing shipments and inspecting goods. They said it was for economic stabilization, but everyone knew what it really was: occupation. Her master, not Kibern, but the new one forced upon her by the bank, delivered her morning reports in a dull, polite tone. My queen, the last of the granaries has been seized. Bravosi agents say the grain was collateral for crown loans. She stared at him with dead eyes. Do I have anything left? He hesitated. The castle, the mountain, and your name. She laughed, a hollow, bitter thing. They can have the name too. The Lannisters always pay their debts. That joke doesn't feel so clever now. Meanwhile, word spread through the streets that the Iron Bank was restoring order. Small folk were offered work digging ditches, repairing roads, and loading ships, all under Bravosi contracts. They were paid just enough to eat, just enough to survive, but not enough to escape. They saved us, a woman told a passing. Barred in Flea Bottom. When the Queen's men were robbing us, Bravos gave us bread. They're better than the crown. That was the tragedy. Cersei lost not just power, but the narrative. The people no longer feared her. They no longer cared. And in the north, Winterfell was tightening its belt. Sansa had turned away 3 Bravosi emissaries. She refused their coin. She refused their contracts, but she could not refuse the cold. Snow had buried roads. Crops had withered. Trade slowed to a crawl, and whispers of rebellion within her own bannermen began to rise. Lady Sansa, Mr. Roderick said one night, House Reed has accepted Bravosi aid. They now fly both the direwolf and the iron coin. She sat in silence for a long moment. Then she stood and walked to the window. The world outside was quiet, too quiet. Just snow and wind, and the crack of ice against the castle walls. They've learned to break kingdoms without lifting a sword, she whispered. But if they think I'll kneel, they've mistaken. The north. But even as she said it, her eyes lingered on the horizon, on the frozen fields, on the empty granaries. The Iron Bank didn't need to attack. It just needed to wait. And it always got what it was owed. By the time spring should have arrived, Westeros still lay buried beneath a curtain of white. Snowdrifts smothered farmland from the neck to the reach, and the rivers that once fed the grain carts froze, thick enough to hold siege engines. But there were no armies moving, no war horns, no banners, no dragons in the sky. The war was still happening, but it was colder than steel and quieter than death. In Old Town, the Mesters finally spoke out. Or rather, one did. Mester Lymos, a man respected for neutrality, stood before a dying crowd of nobles and declared what many had feared. The Iron Bank's influence is not assistance. It is conquest by coin. Our knowledge must remain, free from foreign interest. The next day, his body was found hung from the rafters of the Citadel Library. No note, no blood. No one saw a killer. And yet everyone knew. The faceless men had arrived. Across the sea, Miro Voller signed 3 more contracts before sunrise. One with House Harlaw of the Iron Islands, another with what was left of House Tyrell's broken bannerman, and a third with a strange figure from Essos, a spice trader from Les, offering logistical solutions for Westeros chaos. Funded, of course, by Bravos. Every document he signed was a nail in Westeros' coffin. But Miro didn't hate Westeros. He admired it. The madness of its politics, the stubborn pride of its people. He respected the Starks for refusing their fate. He even envied Cersei's fury, her last scraps of dignity as she drowned in her throne room. But Miro wasn't sentimental. "This isn't conquest," he whispered once to his clerk. "It's cleanup. The cost of their arrogance has come due. We're not the enemy. We are the invoice." Back at King's Landing, Cersei heard rumors of Bravosi agents making offers to her own servants. She started sleeping with a dagger under her pillow, though it hardly mattered anymore. The small council chambers were empty. Qyburn had vanished. The mountain never left her side, but even he seemed like a relic now, a last piece of blood and muscle from an era that had already died. One evening, Seer Gregor brought her a prisoner, a man wrapped in furs, gagged and bound in iron. He was in the kitchen, the guard said. Poison caught him before he touched the wine. She yanked the gag off and stared into the man's face. Not a Sellsword, not a Bravosi. A boy, no older than 16. "Who sent you?" she asked, voice quiet. He smiled. "You owe." The mountain crushed his skull against the floor before he could say more. She didn't scream. She didn't flinch. She just sat back and whispered, "Then let them come. Let them all come." But no one was coming for her. Not anymore. Far in the east, Daenerys stood at the bow of her ship. Her fleet had left Dragonstone behind. She had made a decision. "They're bleeding the realm," she told Tyrion. "Piece by piece. We've fought wars for worse reasons." Tyrion stared at her carefully. "You'll make enemies in Braavos." "I already have," she said. "But the people need something that can't be bought. You think you're that thing?" "No," she replied. "But maybe the fire still is." She didn't wait for the snow to melt. Her dragons flew ahead, black shadows against a gray sky, heading for the Reach, where a Bravosi outpost had been built atop what used to be Horn Hill. When Drogon descended from the clouds, the Bravosi guards barely had time to look up. She didn't conquer. She cleansed. One outpost burned, then another. And slowly, a different kind of fear began to spread. Not of Braavos, but of a queen who still remembered how to make empires kneel. In Winterfell, Sansa received a raven. The message was simple, written in Daenerys' own hand. "They burn. like anything else. For the first time in weeks, Sansa allowed herself a smile. It wasn't hope. Not yet. But it was the start of something the bank hadn't accounted for. Pride, resistance, fire. The numbers no longer favored Bravos as much as they had. And in the Iron Bank's darkest chamber, Miro Voller finally paused before signing another document. A second scroll had arrived, unsigned, unsealed, just one line burned into the parchment. You forgot who you were dealing with. He stared at it for a long time. Then he ordered more contracts drawn, more mercenaries, more assassins. If fire was coming, then Bravos would meet it with coin-fed war. This wasn't over. Not yet. The ash from Horn Hill still floated in the air when the news reached the Iron Bank. 17 Bravosi agents were dead. 2 regional command stations, reconstruction hubs, they called them, had been reduced to blackened earth by dragonfire. Daenerys Targaryen had not declared war, but her flames spoke louder than any envoy ever could. Miro Voller sat silently at his desk, the letter clenched in his hand. The words were brief, almost mocking. You forgot who you were dealing with. He stared at the parchment for a long time before finally burning it in the brazier beside him. The wax seal melted slowly, like blood in a hot pan. This was no longer just about defaulted loans. This was about control. Prepare the ember ledger, he whispered. His clerk looked up, visibly shaken. But sir, that hasn't been used since Volantis, Miro snapped. And what happened to Volantis? The clerk swallowed. It no longer exists. Exactly. The Ember Ledger wasn't a military plan. It was an economic purge. Entire regions erased from the financial map, not with swords, but with systemic collapse. Food shipments cut. Trade routes redirected. Local currencies tanked. With rumors alone. And with Bravos' influence in every port, every guild, every counting house from the Stepstones to Dorne, all it took was a few whispered lies to kill a kingdom without lifting a finger. Meanwhile, in King's Landing, Cersei's world continued to shrink. She no longer sat on the Iron Throne. The seat was empty now, abandoned like a relic of a time no one believed in. She spent her days staring at the Red Keep's dead gardens, the soil frozen, the trees snapped by wind. Her guards, her servants, her allies, gone. The city belonged to the Iron Bank now, even if the walls still bore the Lion's banners. Only one man still stood at her side, Sir Gregor, the Mountain. He didn't speak. He didn't blink. He only followed her like death itself, always just behind. One morning, Cersei walked to the throne room alone, her steps echoing like knives. She stood before the cold, jagged seat and laughed, not from joy, but madness. All the scheming, the battles, the blood. And in the end, I lose to paper, to men in robes with ledgers. But she wasn't done yet. Fetch the wildfire, she told Gregor. The beast turned without a word. If they were going to take her crown, she would burn it with them inside. In the north, Sansa faced a different choice. Bravosi agents had returned with one final offer. Accept a restructuring agreement. Become the Kingdom of the North under protection of Bravos. Keep your name. Keep your castle. Just surrender your sovereignty. She read the contract twice. Then she tore it in half and handed it back. If I have to starve to keep the North free, she said, then so be it. But her council was fracturing. House Glover had already defected. House Mormont remained loyal, but they had little to offer. And from the east, ships bearing Iron Bank crests docked near White Harbor, offloading crates of coin and weapons. We can't fight a war of gold, Mr. Roderick warned her. No, she replied, but we can bleed their men before they buy more. Her message to Daenerys was sent that night. 3 words, light the sky. Daenerys answered. In kind. Her dragons descended upon Lannisport, not the city, but the Braavosi fleet docked at its bay. The ships were filled with coin, trade goods, and soldiers, all gone in a breath of fire. The harbor burned for 3 days. Smoke curled so high it could be seen from Casterly Rock. Braavos retaliated not with swords, but with famine. They declared a continental embargo on Daenerys' forces. They bought out food shipments in the south, collapsing supply lines. They paid pirates from the Stepstones to raid her transports. Even Marine's trade dried up. Gold had turned against her. Not on the battlefield, but in the ports, in the banks, in the minds of hungry peasants. Her soldiers grew restless. Why not take the gold? Grey Worm asked. The Braavosi vaults? They have no honor. Because then I become them, Daenerys said quietly. But the decision weighed heavily. Fire alone would not win this. War. She needed allies. Real ones, old ones. In the Riverlands, Arya Stark stepped from the shadows after years of silence. She wore no banners. She spoke no lies. But when she visited the ruins of Harrenhal, now occupied by Braavosi enforcers, she left behind only bodies and a sigil carved into the stone. The direwolf. Word spread fast. A Stark was hunting again. And not even the Iron Bank could calculate what she was worth. The flames of Lannisport hadn't yet gone out when Westeros truly began to turn. Not because of honor, not because of thrones or birthrights, but because the people, small folk and soldiers alike, finally saw the illusion behind the Iron Bank's power. Gold bought silence. Gold bought soldiers. But gold could not buy loyalty forever. Daenerys' dragons had reminded them of something ancient, something terrifying, something real. Fire. The Iron Bank, for all its precision and quiet control, had made one critical miscalculation. It had believed people would suffer indefinitely for a system they never understood. But fire changed that. In the north, Sansa, Stark stood before a gathering of northern lords, fewer than in years past, but hardened by famine and betrayal. Her words were not flowery. She didn't promise peace, only freedom. We're already dying, she said, her voice sharp as ice, so we might as well die free. The lords of the north, Mormont, Trewyn, Tallheart, and the last of the Karstarks, rose one by one. We follow the wolf, they said, not the coin. In Braavos, Miro Volder watched the rebellion unfold with quiet fury. They burn. One harbor, and the realm forgets we own the rest, he muttered. His advisors, all cloaked in gray, offered numbers. The collapse of 3 major contracts. Dozens of defaults from minor lords. Even Braavosi citizens now questioned the ethics of the bank's actions. We're not losing money, Miro growled. We're losing the illusion of invincibility. And illusions were everything. Initiate the quiet flood, he ordered. It was their final measure. Not war, collapse. The quiet flood began in Old Town, where the Iron Bank ordered. A run on local currency, crashing the value of silver in one day. Farmers were paid with worthless coin. Bread cost a stag. Eggs became rarer than rubies. At the same time, masked Braavosi men began appearing across Westeros again, not killing, but whispering. They offered food in exchange for loyalty, grain in exchange for secrets, a blanket in exchange for a betrayal. Whole towns turned on their lords for a sack of flour. In the Reach, entire villages changed allegiance without a sword drawn. All it took was hunger. Even Daenerys Unsullied began deserting in quiet pairs. They had discipline, yes, but discipline meant little when their stomach caved in on itself. Tyrion noticed first, the Iron Bank's not fighting us. It's starving us into irrelevance. And I'm feeding them with fire, Daenerys said coldly. She burned 3 more outposts that week. But it wasn't enough. For every vault she scorched, 5 more shipments of gold moved silently by sea. The Iron Bank wasn't a beast. It was a system. You couldn't kill it. You had to unmake it. Tyrion proposed something radical. What if we end the bank not by fire, but by truth? Daenerys narrowed her eyes. Explain. We reveal everything. The contracts. The puppet kings. The assassinations. Their books. Burn their secrets, not their ships. And so it began. In the ruins of King's Landing, Cersei Lannister stood before barrels of wildfire. She wore no crown, no gown, only black. The Red Keep's foundations were riddled with tunnels. Qyburn had long ago filled with fire. If she couldn't rule it, she would deny it to all. But before she gave the order, a whisper reached her chamber. A name, Arya Stark, and then darkness. When dawn came, the wildfire never exploded. No one ever saw Arya leave the Red Keep, but they found Cersei the next morning, bound, gagged, and thrown before the crumbling iron throne. A message pinned to her chest. No queen, no bank, just dust. That same week, Tyrion's plan went into motion. Across Westeros, letters began appearing, delivered by sparrows, ravens, even smugglers. Contracts signed by lords under duress. Payments made for assassinations. Entire maps showing how the Iron Bank divided Westeros into investment sectors. The people read. And for the first time, they understood. The Iron Bank wasn't just a foreign power. It was a parasite, and parasites only thrive in the dark. Now, the world was watching. The illusion cracked. And Braavos, for the first time in its long golden history, felt the shiver of fear. It was strange how fast power crumbled when people simply stopped believing in it. The Iron Bank had ruled not with armies or dragons, but with reputation, a reputation of untouchability, of cold certainty. The Iron Bank always gets its due. That phrase once held more weight than 1,000 swords. But now it was being mocked in taverns from Dorne to the Wall. They always get their due? Barked a farmer in the Riverlands, half drunk on stolen wine. Well, tell them to eat their bloody contracts then. What Daenerys and Tyrion unleashed wasn't just a rebellion. It was an infection of truth. With every document revealed, with every name exposed, the myth of Braavos melted. People learned the truth. Lords had sold their own towns for coin. Faith leaders had been bribed to look the other way. Entire houses had been reduced to vassals not of kings, but of accountants. Even in Essos, where Braavos once stood like a god above nations, people began to protest. Not violently, just quietly, in the kind of way that shook men like Nero Voller more than any sword ever could. They withdrew their trust. They questioned the numbers. And when a bank loses trust, it bleeds faster than any kingdom. In Braavos, Miro stood at the balcony of the Iron Bank's highest tower, looking out over the city he once ruled like a shadow king. Withdrawals have tripled, his steward whispered. The Lyseni are calling in their loans. Even Mir has hesitated. Miro didn't respond. He watched the ships in the harbor, some leaving with gold, others simply leaving. You were wrong, said a voice behind him. He turned. The hooded figure stepped forward, her face unreadable. A woman, Bravosi accent, no insignia. You believed the world would kneel for coin, she said, but they don't want money. They want meaning. Miro narrowed his eyes. Who sent? You? She smiled faintly. No one. Everyone. And then she was gone. He knew what she was. Not a threat. A message. The faceless men had turned. Even death had stopped taking his orders. In Winterfell, Sansa watched her courtyards fill again, with men who came not for pay, but for purpose. Farmers who brought salted meat, blacksmiths who repaired blades for free, little girls handing her messages tied with red thread. The North was no longer just resisting. It was healing. She met with Daenerys in the Godswood, not as a queen and a lady, but as survivors of a system that tried to erase them. "They won't vanish quietly," Sansa said. "No," Daenerys replied. "But they're already bleeding." "Then we finish it," Sansa whispered. "Not with war. With replacement." That was Tyrion's final stroke of genius. Not just destroy the Iron Bank. Replace it. The next week, Daenerys announced the formation of the Flame Charter, a new alliance of free cities and kingdoms based on public accountability, shared rebuilding, and transparency. A coinless agreement. Trade would continue, but no more. Silent masters. No more faceless debts. The Iron Bank laughed when they heard the name. A fantasy, one board member spat. But fantasies were what killed empires. The Reach signed first. Then Dorne. Then parts of Essos, even Karth, ever skeptical, agreed to limited trade under the charter. Braavos began hemorrhaging faster. Then it could hide. Their gold sat in vaults untouched. Their influence evaporated. Miro received his last report 3 weeks later. The Iron Bank of Braavos is now officially in liquidity crisis. The market hall has been burned. A council has fled. He read the words, then tore the page. He didn't flee. He sat in silence in that cold marble office, surrounded by contracts, maps, and dust. No soldiers came for him, no assassins. Just irrelevance. And that was worse than death. In King's Landing, the throne was gone. Not destroyed, just removed. The Iron Throne, melted and shattered in the final skirmish for the Red Keep, was never rebuilt. There was no new crown, no king. Just a council of lords and leaders, chosen by their people, not their birth. Cersei Lannister was exiled. Not executed, not glorified. She died in a nameless village 2 years later, whispering to herself about debts and dragons. The Iron Bank had declared war on Westeros. But it forgot one thing. Westeros never forgets its enemies. And when the time came, it didn't pay its debt in gold. It paid it in fire, in silence, and in unity. Piece by piece, Westeros had been sold, and piece by piece, it bought itself back. Years passed, not many, but enough for Westeros to breathe again. The flames of war had died. The dragon's shadow no longer stretched across the land. The ravens no longer carried threats or contracts, only news of births, marriages, harvests. The world had not become perfect, but it had survived, and that was enough. The Iron Bank of Braavos still existed, technically. A crumbling building. By the sea, where pigeons nested on cracked marble pillars. No lines at the counter, no guards at the doors. Only a handful of old men counting coins that no longer mattered. Miro Voller hadn't been seen in over a year. Some say he walked into the sea. Some say he's hiding in Lys, drunk and broke. Others whisper he was killed by the very faceless men who once worked for him, not for vengeance, but as balance. The books had to be closed, one way or another. In Braavos itself, a new council rose, younger, hungrier, less arrogant. They abandoned conquest. They joined the Flame Charter reluctantly, but they joined, because even they understood. The world had turned, and there was no going back. In the North, Winterfell thrived. Sansa Stark never called herself queen. Not once. She was just Lady Sansa, though everyone knew her rule ran deeper than any crown ever had. She opened the gates to broken houses, took in bastards, orphans, exiled knights. She rebuilt not with gold, but with grain, loyalty, and memory. When asked how she survived the bank's war, she would say, "Because I knew what hunger feels like, and I made sure no one else would ever feel it again." Arya was never seen again in any court or council. But sometimes in the East, when a corrupt banker or a war profiteer turned up dead with a coin in their mouth, people whispered, "The wolf is still hunting." In the South, Gendry ruled the Stormlands, not as a puppet of bravos, but as a man who'd seen both sides, poverty and power. He built roads, funded schools, and never took another loan in his life. He had learned that real power comes not from what you borrow, but from what you build. And Daenerys? She disappeared too. Not in death. No songs were sung for her dying. She simply left. Some say she went east with her dragons, to find a place where no one knew her name. Others believe she still watches, from above, flying alone under a sky that no longer fears fire. But before she vanished, she left behind a single line carved into the stone at Dragonstone. Burn only what you must, then rebuild better. Tyrion Lannister, too, faded from public life. He returned to the ruins of Casterly Rock, not to rule, but to drink, to think, and to write. His last book was never published, but those who read the only surviving copy said it ended with this: the Iron Bank declared war on Westeros. But in the end, they didn't lose to dragons. They lost to something older, a kingdom's memory, a people's rage. And the day the last coin fell into the dust, the world finally exhaled.